Hi, my name is Lucy, and I wanted to discuss a subject that I find very interesting and something that influences my life. So, I wanted to talk about the subject of something called yellow fever. Now, it's obviously not the disease yellow fever, although I did get a vaccination for yellow fever when I went to Africa, and I do think that I may have gotten a mild case of yellow fever. That's not what I'm talking about, though, obviously. What I am talking about is this term being used to describe the fetishization and the preference for Asian women by white men. But before I go into kind of everything I'm going to talk about, I want to just put out a little disclaimer about kind of the point of view that I'm coming from. So, first of all, I'm coming from a point of view where I'm mostly going to be talking about this from an American perspective. I myself am American, so this is kind of the perspective I have. But I know that a lot of this applies to other Western countries, like the UK, Australia. I've seen articles from each of those places also discussing yellow fever. It's not only here. But I'm also going to be taking this from an East Asian point of view. So I myself am Chinese. I know this happens a lot to me. It happens a lot to people who are Korean, Japanese, kind of that group of Asian. I'm not really going to be discussing people from like Western Asia really as much. But I personally don't think that just this term applies as much to those people. I'm also going to be talking about this from a pretty heterosexual lens. I'm going to be talking about the fact that yellow fever is affecting Asian women, perpetrated by white men in most cases. Now, this is mostly due to the fact that I couldn't find very much research, or really any research, about this being a phenomenon within the LGBTQ plus community, nor about men or non-binary as much. I found a little bit about men, but personally, I really do think that this kind of needs to be taken from a heterosexual lens, just because of the power dynamic between men and women in this particular subject, as well as the historical aspects that I'll talk about a little bit later. So I think that it's not a bad thing to take it from this lens, and I think that's where most people end up taking it from. And also I think that Asian men end up actually having a separate issue. They have kind of the opposite issue. They've been kind of emasculated by Western society, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on when I get into historical context. So anyway, I hope that helps a little bit as I start talking about this, knowing where I'm coming from. Let's talk about how people defend yellow fever. There's really one way that people defend it, right? So it's often defended by saying that it's merely a phenotypic, or another word for that is physical attraction, and that it has nothing to do with the stereotypes that are attached to Asian women. Right, so it's just, oh, you've got that beautiful, glossy, black hair, and you've got, like, kind of almond eyes and, like, tanner skin, and that's great. It's interesting that people can say that, but what they're using here is something called the mere preferences argument. So I'm going to call this MPA probably from now on, because it's kind of a mouthful to continuously say mere preferences argument. But basically what it argues, it has 2 points that come to a conclusion. So the first point is that there is nothing morally objectable about sexual preferences for, hair color, eye color, and other non-racialized phenotypic traits. So they're saying that's totally fine. And then what they go in and say is that preferences for racialized physical traits are no different than non-racialized phenotypic traits. That is debatable, in my opinion, but obviously, from those 2 points, they concluded that, therefore, mere preferences for racialized phenotypic traits are not morally objectable. So this is the argument that people use when they tell me that it's a compliment that I'm favored over women of other races because I have this great Asian appearance or whatever, right? So these people are also subscribing to the idea of a minimal race. So minimal race is basically the idea that race is just based on phenotypic traits and geographic ancestry, and that there should be no weight put on any particular physical, mental, or moral traits to these different groups that you've sectioned off, right? So, I mean, some people call this looking at bloodlines and bodies, which is kind of creepy. I don't love that, but that's what people say. But obviously it's a very colorblind approach to this subject. Being colorblind basically means believing that there's no differences between races to a really ignorant level. So we can all say that scientifically, when you look at the races, it is just phenotypic differences, right? I mean, we all developed in different geographic areas, and that's why we look the way we do. So scientifically, within our bodies, we are the same, but history has changed what it means to be Asian, what it means to be Black, what it means to be white, what it means to be Latinx, right? In certain areas, it just has. And so just because race is socially constructed, it doesn't mean that it doesn't carry weight. It still does. And so these kind of colorblind arguments, these colorblind thoughts, are kind of ignorant, and it basically ignores the struggles, the marginalizations, and I mean the unique perspectives that people of color can provide and that they have in a white-dominated country such as the United States. People believe that this is a progressive way of thinking, but it actually causes a lot of problems. They kind of take this from a post-racist lens, but we don't live in a post-racist world. Racism is still here. So you can't just say, oh, I don't see color, because you're really harming everybody who does have experiences based on the way that they look, right? So this whole minimal race thing is not something I buy into. The thing is, though, is that unfortunately a lot of Asians align themselves with this colorblind approach to life due to the proximity of whiteness that they have, okay? So responding to racism or racist experiences for a lot of Asians is very difficult. Now, what do I mean when I say proximity to whiteness? Proximity to whiteness, I mean this by saying that Asians are what Americans call the model minority. And this is a model minority myth that basically came about because Asian people were exhibiting high levels of education, they were kind of killing it economically, and they were very willing to culturally assimilate themselves to fit in and, you know, kind of try not to rub anybody the wrong way, just kind of keep their head down and do their best. I mean, so some people go as far to say that Asian people are honorary whites, which is kind of weird. A lot of people tell me that I should be proud of being this model minority, right? Something to be proud of. I should be happy that the stereotypes that people put on me are not necessarily mean or degrading. But for me, I don't think that that means that they're still not harmful. I really think that they still are. I think that saying that I'm supposed to be great at math, your girl's not that good. I'm gonna be honest. I mean, I got a 2 in AP Calc. That's failing. That's not great. So, it's unrealistic to have any stereotypical expectations for certain races. It's unrealistic. There are several ways to go about rejecting the MPA, right? So first you can tackle just that first aspect, which I'll remind you is basically saying that there's nothing wrong with preferring certain phenotypic traits, okay? So this can be rejected in a couple of ways. Just the first argument, which if you take away the first argument, then the whole conclusion is obviously null and void. One argument is that having somebody have preferred phenotypic traits discriminates against the group that does not possess these phenotypic traits. I don't think this is a great argument, I'm gonna be honest. I think that it's kind of crazy to expect or hope through this argument that every person would be able to fit all the traits that every other person would want. Some people are going to be somebody's cup of tea and not somebody else's cup of tea. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that exactly. I think that certain traits are very socially constructed, such as, being thin and wanting a thin person. I think that, I guess not everybody wants a thin person, but obviously society makes it so that thin people are beautiful. So I think that that is probably not great, and it does discriminate against people who are not super thin. So that is an issue. But I think that when we're taking it from this racialized point of view, saying that people like the Asian features rather than white people's features or any other race's features, is a little bit ridiculous, because there's always going to be somebody who wants something else. I basically think that they're focusing on the wrong group of people. I think that non-Asian women are not missing out by men who have yellow fever. Asian women are honestly suffering due to the physical preferences of white males who have a thing for Asians. I think they're suffering. Another argument that rejects MPA is a feminist argument, one that basically argues that treating attractiveness itself as a prerequisite to love and sex is oppressive on its own. So this is due to the fact that women are already judged and valued for how well they conform to beauty norms, rather than other aspects of their being, such as, their intellect, their abilities, and, other non-beauty related traits. Now, I think this is an interesting argument, but unfortunately I think that it's a bit unrealistic, because I think that attractiveness is always going to be a prerequisite for love and sex. I don't think that it needs to be a specific type of attractiveness. I think that, somebody's gonna find somebody attractive that maybe you don't find attractive, but that doesn't really matter. As we say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So I think that it's always gonna be a prerequisite. Do I think that it should be the only thing that people are looking at? Obviously not. And nor am I saying that the other factors of women are not important. I think they are. And I also think that as people get to know each other, they will start to appreciate each other for more than just their appearance, I would hope. But I think that from the beginning, with an initial attraction, things like, a symmetrical face, they're gonna be a natural attraction. And I just think that's just gonna happen. And I don't think that we can really critique it from that point of view. I do think that what we could explore is why certain traits are more attractive and what kinds of social constructions are kind of at work behind that. But that's obviously kind of a different discussion. One which I would love to have, but not the point of this particular video. But anyway, both of these, former arguments say that having preferences for phenotypical traits itself, just that, is morally objectable. So there's another argument that will tackle the second aspect, which, again, to remind you, is basically that having preference for racialized traits is no different from having preference for non-racialized traits. To reject this, we must first establish that individuals' racialized fetishes always depend on racial stereotypes, rather than just pure aesthetic features. And second, that men who say that they don't like Asian women due to the stereotypes about them, that really can't be said objectively, because finding origins of sexual preference is not clear to most people, because everything develops kind of in a weird way, especially sexual preferences. I personally think this is the strongest argument to take down MPA. I think that it's really impossible to separate stereotypes from claiming a preference for a specific race. I really think it's impossible to separate those two things. I don't think it can be purely aesthetic. I think that inherently there is something about the race, not just appearance, that these men find fascinating or intriguing. This is definitely due to the stereotypes and the exoticism of Asian women. I think that the argument that men cannot objectively say that they are not interested in Asian women because of stereotypes is interesting. I think that it's definitely difficult to know where these fetishes come from, as well as the fact that, let's be honest, white men come from a really privileged place, that basically acknowledging their own racial biases and prejudices would be really difficult for them. I'm not saying that they shouldn't do it. I think they should definitely do it. But I think that it is difficult if nobody's helping them on that journey, or they don't kind of get on it themselves. So, what are the reasons for yellow fever? First, we need to talk about Orientalism and its relation to imperialism and exoticism. Okay, so let's start in the 13th and 14th century of Europe. So at this point, the Silk Road has just, been established and people are, imagining the Far East or whatever, right? The West was seen as something called Occidental, otherwise known as normal, standard, kind of the center of everything, while the East was deemed something called the Orient or Oriental, right? Which kind of means that it's abnormal, it's exotic, it's foreign, and people only knew what they were told about. That's all they knew. They couldn't just go there, obviously. It's a pretty big journey and not everybody could just go there. So it's kind of just based on stories. So Orientalism emphasized the Occidental traits of the West and the Oriental traits of the East. So the result was basically that Western men were seen as good, moral, virile, of course, and powerful, while the East became more and more otherized, and became everything the West wasn't. Orientalism was used to redefine the East for Western audiences, as well as supposedly, honor them. It's debatable. So this created a fascination with the East. The fascination is known as exoticism. So it's basically seeing something as different, foreign, strange, but, intriguing at the same time. The West painted the East as exotic, but also as barbaric. Eastern women were described as sexually insatiable creatures that were giant, which is funny because, we're generally not that big. While men were described as being meek and small and unassertive. So you can already see kind of just the picture that they're painting for people, and that a lot of people don't have their own experiences, so they just believe whatever, Marco Polo says about the East. So the land of the East was very feminized by Orientalism, which made it easier for the strong and virile West to dominate and conquer the people of the East during the era of imperialism. This dehumanized the people of the East and made them something to be possessed, right? And this is going to carry over to the way that men see Asian women. Orientalism innately defined Asia as not normal and always keeps Asians as kind of an other. So you can see how this can make Asian women feel like they are just lumped into a homogenized and depersonalized group. And this makes Asian women feel very objectified and replaceable. I mean, obviously. I mean, there are so many jokes about Asians that we all look the same, and it's just frankly not true, obviously. So this feminizing of the Asian land left Asian women double feminized, and Asian men emasculated, which I talked about before at the very beginning, saying that Asian men are kind of seen as not desirable, right? So Asian women are frequently found in dating sites and in dating studies to be the most desired, while focusing on just kind of race, while Asian men were pretty consistently found to be the least desirable. So the double feminization of Asian women makes the burden of femininity even more difficult to carry. So this leads to harmful stereotypes about what type of lover and woman an Asian woman will be. Will she be that geisha, China doll, lotus blossom, whatever you want to call it, these are all kind of names, which expects her to be this kind of domestic and submissive and subservient woman, which is what a lot of people believe that we are? Or will she be, the dragon lady, which basically means that she's super seductive and sexually insatiable type of woman? Unfortunately, many men expect both. They say that things like they want a princess in the streets and a tiger in the sheets, which is really creepy and weird, but people say that, and it's not great. And obviously this is too much to expect, and too much to put on to one type of woman. To only have two options, they're not great, either of them, and also sometimes they're expected to even be both. Not only are these stereotypes obviously not true, but just as Asians are said to be the model minority, Asian women are seen as the sexual model minority. Most of this came from an anti-feminist man. They saw Asian women as women who could conform to Western beauty standards, and that they continue to fulfill an inferior position within the relationship and within family that white women eventually were less willing to kind of do due to feminist kind of movements that were starting to grow. And the idea of having this submissive, obedient, docile Asian woman was very appealing. Far-right men in America, actually, including neo-Nazis, are actually often taking Asian wives for these reasons, which, if we go back to the idea of this model minority, Asians are seen as this honorary white person, so I guess that's why they're okay with an Asian woman. Honestly, white America has seen, Asian women from an almost exclusive sexual light. I mean, military occupation in the East and Southeast Asia, war brides, sex tourism, pornography, and mail order brides, kind of exposed white men to a specific type of Asian woman. And this is the same type that Asian men expect to find, but, in ordinary modern day Asians who are, not prostitutes or porn stars or helpless war victims. A large exposure to Asian women and the fetishization was during war occupation during World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. Women began going back to the West with their white husbands during war times, which created kind of this savior narrative, this white savior narrative. And this is due to the fact that these Asian countries were kind of third world countries, and that women needed to be plucked from them in order to have, a good life. Two examples of the savior narrative, as well as the American, GI who falls in love with an Oriental woman, are Puccini's opera Madame Butterfly and the musical Miss Saigon. So they pretty much have very similar plot lines. So they both have an American soldier who's stationed somewhere in the East, right? So in Madame Butterfly, they have a man who's stationed in Japan. And then in Miss Saigon, they have a man who's stationed in Vietnam during Vietnam War. So Madame Butterfly has this kind of Japanese geisha character who the white man falls in love with and marries. But then he leaves. And, don't worry, he comes back 3 years later with a white woman that he just married. And this poor Japanese woman, Madame Butterfly, or Xiao Xiao-san, she sacrificed everything to be with this man. She sacrificed her religion, she sacrificed her family. She cared so much about him, and he just left and married a white woman. And it ended up that she had a son with him that he didn't know about, and then when he comes back, he says that he wants the son. And because she believes that his life is going to be better going back to America with him, she gives the son to him, and then she stabs herself because she's nothing and has nothing without him. So that's rough. Miss Saigon, super similar plotline. She's Vietnamese. She's named Kim, or Miss Saigon. And basically this American soldier, falls in love, marries her. He leaves, of course, marries a white woman, comes back, finds out that he has a kid with Kim, wants the kid. She gives him the kid. And basically, they just self-sacrifice themselves over and over and over again. And this guy takes a kid and she shoots herself. So what do these stories have to do with yellow fever? Both of these shows are actually still very popular, but they both obviously send a very exoticized and orientalized message about Asian women and white men. Both women are extremely desirable because of their good looks and their, foreign nature, as well as how much they self-sacrifice for these men in their lives. And these men are kind of giving them nothing in return. And this helps shape the subservient and obedient stereotype of Asian women. They exist for the purpose of fulfilling a white man's needs. They themselves are not worthy to be their real wives, right? Both of these men see these Asian women as sexually desirable, but end up married to, a white American woman because they think that that's the right woman that they should end up with. But they both have children with this, sexually desirable Asian woman, but they don't want her for anything but that child. The men have a white savior complex because they believe that they're saving these Asian women. They made them Christians, they made them more civilized because, it's barbaric East, and yet they're drawn to their exoticism. They're also, kind of saving their sons from a life in the Far East and bring them back to the US to have a good life. We gotta talk a little bit more about just another idea that relates to yellow fever. So this is the idea of mere sexual exoticism. So basically what it says is that people who have racialized fetishes are not necessarily coming from a racist place or even a malicious place. So for me, I ask the question, does it matter? I mean, do I care if the person who has yellow fever, if they're coming from a racist or malicious place? I mean, honestly, not really, because I still have the effects of racial fetishization, and it's not great. I think that it's problematic, no matter what the underlying psychology is. Plus, we've already discussed that it's kind of impossible to separate a racial fetish from the racial stereotypes that are attached to it. But now that I've contextualized a lot of Asian fetishization within history, let's talk about the burden that Asian women actually currently suffer due to yellow fever. So first, yellow fever creates an othering effect due to the fact that there is a difference between being beautiful and sexy and being a beautiful, sexy Asian. Either people say that Asian women are pretty for being Asian, or they're pretty as an Asian. So I don't love when people tell me like, oh, you're so pretty for an Asian person. It's just like, oh, so all of my race is like lower than everybody else, right? But then when people say, oh, you're so pretty because you're Asian, it's like, oh, that's kind of weird too. I don't love that. But basically being measured against these white beauty norms and either not measuring up because they're Asian, or being beautiful because they're different and exotic from these white beauty standards, those are kind of the two options for Asian women to have. Second, the targets of Asian fetish, such as Asian women, have multiple burdens due to the fetish. I mean, Asian women spend so much emotional and psychological labor fulfilling, resisting, or negotiating all of these like weird racialized advances by men who target them. And this is a racial disadvantage. This is also an intersectional disadvantage. Now I'm going to only briefly talk about intersectionality if you're not familiar, because it's a really important issue and it's really important to this issue, but I could make a whole video about it and this video is getting really long. I'm really sorry about that. So I'm just going to do like a little overview. So intersectionality is basically the idea that people who come with multiple levels of marginalization, such as being both a woman and being a person of color, they suffer discrimination from both marginalized groups. So they suffer issues about being a woman, but they also suffer issues about being, let's say, Asian. But then they also have their own like specific issues because they're an Asian woman. This issue of yellow fever is specifically an intersectional issue because Asian women are people who are suffering it. Women themselves, just regular women, who are not Asian, do not suffer this. Asian men, I've found a couple of reports about it, but it's generally not suffered by them. And so when I talked a while back, another great example is the double feminization of Asian women, right? So they're feminized because they're women, but then also because Asians themselves and the Asian land and the history has feminized Asia itself, which means that their race is also feminizing them. So they have this like extra femininity pressure. Unfortunately also, Asian women often come into kind of every encounter with every potential partner with constant suspicion or doubt if that potential partner is white. You ask these questions like, is being Asian the only reason they came up to me? Is my race the only, attractive quality about me to them, which is really creepy. I myself had a boyfriend, not very long, but I did. I had a boyfriend who told me straight up that he kind of had yellow fever, which should have been a warning sign, hindsight. It wasn't a great relationship. But yeah, he told me, oh, I've only dated Asian women. It's very creepy when people say that. I don't recommend you saying that. But yeah, he told me that he really loved Asian women, and there was another guy who told me that he knew that the next woman that he would be with would be Asian, which I was like, ugh, well, it's not gonna be me. But personally, I've actually only had white boyfriends. And especially the beginning, I didn't really think about all of this yellow fever stuff because it hadn't happened to me yet. And so it didn't make me kind of cautious. But actually, after that boyfriend who said he had yellow fever, I have been really cautious about the men who I'm with. I've happened to only date white men. It's not like my fetish. I just happen to kind of live in places where it's mostly white, live in the Midwest. But it is something that I always think about. Those questions about, do they like me for me? Or do they like me because of my Asian features? It's just kind of creepy and weird. And I do spend a lot of psychological and emotional labor thinking about it. But men who have yellow fever will often say how much they love my culture, which is a weird thing to say. And also the thing is that 90% of my culture is being an American. You know, I was adopted from China, and I've lived my whole life pretty much in America. And my dad just happens to be Chinese, but he also grew up in America. And even his mom grew up in America. She's like more Chinese than Dad and I. Like, Dad's really not Chinese, culturally. And my grandmother, she's taught me as much as I will learn and kind of get into. But my culture isn't being Chinese. And so it's kind of weird and uncomfortable. Unfortunately, another side effect of this is that stereotypes of Asian women render them extremely vulnerable to sexual assault and sexual violence. And obviously, white men who think that Asian women are willing to please them and kind of do anything for them is really dangerous in a world that we already have a lot of issues with consent, and consent's just not always respected. And I feel like that if you have this mindset that, Asian women are always interested and are always willing to please you, that it's gonna cause a lot of problems. So what can be done, right? I guess that's the biggest question. It's really hard to find a solution that can be implemented and really change the situation immediately. But something I can say is that men need to think about their preferences and assess where they really come from. Although we have already established that earlier, it's very difficult to do so. People need to stop seeing the world in a colorblind way, living in this post-racist world, and we're just not there. And people need to be cognizant about the amount of emotional labor that Asian women go through in many of their encounters. Men just, come up to you talking about their samurai sword collection, and if you speak Korean, people need to educate themselves about why yellow fever is not a compliment. And watching this video was a great start. So I hope that you have been educated and you can share this video if you want, I guess. Thanks so much for watching and have a great day.